Hey, fifth grade. Today for our poetry lesson, we're going to be reading two more poems, Peaches by Peter Davison and Craisins by Michael Conley Carter. Before we get started, I kind of want to remind you of something that I drew your attention to yesterday in our poetry lesson, and that was onomatopoeia. Those were sound words that sound like their meaning. Today's poems play with the sound of words also. They're just for fun, but they make a point too. As Peter Davison put it, it's awesome what English can do. These poems dance. I think you'll see what I mean. Follow along as I read Peaches. A mouthful of language to swallow. Stretches of beach, sweet clinches, breaches in walls, pleached branches. Breeches hauled over haunches, hunched leeches, wrenched teachers. What English can do, ransack the warmth that chuckles beneath fuzz surfaces, smooth velvet richness, plashy juices. I beseech you, peach, clench me into the sweetness of your reaches. And now follow along as I read Craisins. A sweetness of the sour kind can make whole worlds with a fruity lust. Craisins or bust. I need that mouthful of tart texture and absolute flavor. The juicy burst that ripens beneath the wrinkled layer of newborn fruit. The one that I'm cravin', the cranberry of all raisins, the craisin. Now, I want to talk about a few things before I have you guys go back in and analyze. The first is that these poems were not necessarily about a deep meaning. In Peaches, this poet was playing around with the sounds and the effects of words. He was talking about a mouthful of language to swallow. Then he also said what English can do. So it's very fitting that we're reading these because we've talked before about poetry is meant to be read out loud, that it's just as much about the sound of your words as it is the meaning. And this one is definitely about the sound of the words, more so, in fact, than the meaning. But even though, especially Peaches, probably sounded like a bunch of nonsense as I was reading it, I imagine that there were probably a few sensations that struck you as I was reading it. And it was simply the sound of words that did that. So I'm going to break down this first poem and point out a few things, and then I'll talk to you about Craisins. One little piece of interesting information that I want you to have is that Michael Conley Carter, was an eighth grader, and he wrote the poem Craisins after reading Peter Davison's poem Peaches. So you know how I'm encouraging you guys to take things or devices or tools or techniques that you're seeing the poets that we're reading during poetry analysis and applying that to your own free verse poems. That's exactly what happened in this case. Michael had read the poem Peaches and he liked how Peter Davison played around with words, and so then he wrote Craisins, and so it's only fitting that we're talking about these two together. The other thing that I want to talk to you about is sound devices. I've been talking to you about alliteration, how it is the beginning of a consonant sound that is repeated in words that are very close to each other, like Sally sells seashells. The sa and the sh sound is being repeated. If we're repeating vowel sounds, that's not called alliteration. It's a different form of alliteration. So it's called assonance, and it's the repetition of the same vowel sound. And you guys know vowels usually are found in the middle of a poem, or not a poem, a word. And so you will hear some examples of assonance in this poem. So I'll show you what I mean. So we have beach, sweet, okay? That's assonance or assonance, because you hear the E, it's like a long E sound, and that can be spelled with an E and A working together, or in this case, double E's. Then we see this again. We see this sound device again in the next lines where we see breeches and pleached. Okay, that's assonance. And then we see some alliteration of the H sound. So this is assonance when we're repeating the vowel sound. And then when we see a consonant sound being repeated, like hauled over, haunches, hunched, leeches, that is actually alliteration. Okay. I want to talk about this word pleached also. It means interwoven like branches in a hedge or an arbor. Okay. So if we're talking about pleached branches, they're like really thick. They're like interwoven within the bush itself. Then let's also talk about this word, plashy. It actually means marshy. So like if you think about a swamp or a marsh, the ground isn't really solid. It's pretty squishy and wet. Okay. Again, that word is meant to refer to land, but here it is being used to get you to have a sensation in a poem about peaches. So I wanted to talk about that too, because this is a poem about peaches, and he uses a bunch of different words that have nothing to do with peaches to get the effect. When I think about peaches, sorry, not poems, I think I can totally relate to this. Fuzz surfaces, smooth velvet, richness. Okay, I hate that part of the peach, but I love the part that you get to when you bite through that. And when I bite into a peach that is ripe, I almost feel like I need to be wearing a bib because it just squirts everywhere. And by using the word plashy, it means marshy, but plashy, it sounds peachy and sounds juicy. And it does mean marshy, which means saturated, right? But normally we wouldn't use that word when we're talking about peaches, just like we probably wouldn't use the word pleached branches when we're talking about peaches either. So anyway, I think you get the point that the power of words, the words have the power to evoke sensations and get our salivary glands flowing. So I don't know about you, but I'm kind of craving a peach after this. Again, I told you guys that Craisins was written by Michael after he read Peter Davison's poem Peaches. And so he was trying to play around with words. Obviously, his makes a little bit more sense. There's more meaning involved in Michael's poem. You see some alliteration in Michael's poem as well when you the t sound right here where you see that mouthful of tart texture. The t sound is being repeated. I just want to draw your attention to some of the powerful words like sweetness and sour and juicy, burst, ripens beneath, wrinkled layer, and newborn fruit down here. These are all really specific, and the sound has a lot of impact as well as the meaning. So here's what I want you to do when you go back into these poems. You're not even going to believe it, because I'm going to keep it simple today. I'm not going to ask you to go into really deep detail. I just want you to go back into these poems and mark the words and lines that you like the sound of. Just say, I like the sound of this. But be mindful when you're selecting your words. Don't just slap something in there to get it done. This is about us learning to think analytically and be able to convey those thoughts to people when we communicate. Also, we're writing our own poems, so I want you to keep this in mind too. As poets, don't be afraid to play with words, to take pleasure in exploring the relationships between sound and meaning. See if you can tickle your reader's ears. So this is a technique that you might try in your own poems. I love you guys and miss you. Please let me know if you have any questions or you need anything. I can't wait to see your faces in person someday soon.